What if I told you that in ancient Greece, beauty, if you were male, could be a curse, even a death sentence? Forget what you think you know about concubines. The image that comes to mind is usually that of veiled women behind palace walls, China, Persia, the Ottoman Empire. But in the birthplace of Western civilization, things were different. In ancient Greece, concubinage wasn't limited to women, that young boys, some barely older than children, were chosen, taken, and trained. Their purpose? To entertain, to serve, to obey. And most chilling of all, it wasn't a secret shame. It was a societal norm. Even revered. Across many ancient cultures, men of power were expected to have concubines. These secondary partners served two functions: to showcase a man's virility through offspring, and to indulge his pleasures without restraint. Greek men followed this model. Prominent figures in Athens, Sparta, and beyond often kept not one, but multiple concubines paraded in public like prized possessions. But what sets Greece apart is this: a vast number of these concubines were male. Yes, male concubines were not an exception, they were widespread. In fact, they were often the norm. Behind the marble facades and embroidered tunics, behind the smiles and ceremony, lay a truth soaked in silence and pain. These boys lived not as companions, but as property. Behind every flute performance or polished smile was a child stripped of autonomy. For many, the cost of beauty was trauma. So the question must be asked: was life as a male concubine in ancient Greece ever truly worth it? To understand, we must look at the power dynamics of the time. In Greece, a man's status wasn't just measured by land or wealth, but also by the people he controlled. Keeping concubines wasn't a private indulgence, it was a public performance. Of power. Love, affection, mutual respect, these were not required. What mattered was dominance. And so long as a man maintained the upper hand regardless of his partner's age or gender, society looked the other way. This is the world that male concubines were brought into. Their relationships were rarely equal. Often, they were built between an older man respected and influential and a much younger boy, usually in his early teens. The older man was called the Erastes, the mentor, the initiator. The boy was the Ereminos, or catamite, the passive, submissive pupil. Together, they formed the institution of Persty. To some philosophers, pederasty was noble and educational bond between man and boy. But this nobility was often a thin mask over coercion and abuse. The reality? These relationships were transactional. A boy might receive lessons in rhetoric, politics, or music, but only in exchange for sexual access. In some places, like Sparta, these arrangements were institutionalized, celebrated. Boys are essentially handed over to older men as part of their upbringing. Mentorship, they called it. Manipulation. History shows us. Yet views varied. Athens began to draw lines. Laws were introduced to protect freeborn boys, but always with loopholes. In Athens, for example, male-to-male penetration was banned if both parties were adults. But if the passive partner was a boy, society looked the other way. That's how abuse flourished, dressed in the robes of tradition and education. These boys were expected to be more than lovers. They were entertainers. Many were trained in music, dance, and poetry. At grand symposia drinking parties for the elite, they served wine, recited verse, and offered themselves in more ways than one. And though they wore gold jewelry and fine linen, their value was not in what they wore, it was in how well they pleased. Some were enslaved. Others sold by their own families, driven by poverty, desperation, or the hope of favor from the wealthy. Few had any say in their fate, and for some, the horror was even greater. To preserve their youthful appearance, smooth skin, high voice, no beard boys were sometimes castrated. This wasn't rare. It was methodical. They were perfumed, dressed in women's clothing, and styled to appear eternally boyish. These so-called delicate boys were groomed purely for sexual satisfaction. Castration was both physical and symbolic, a way to mark them as permanent subordinates. This wasn't done in hiding. Society watched and said nothing. Artifacts like the Warren Cup, a Roman silver drinking vessel, reveal how normalized this was. The cup graphically depicts scenes of men with boys, not tucked away in shame, but displayed as luxury art, something to admire. Some boys were protected, if they were freeborn, from powerful families. They wore a toga praetexta, a garment that marked them as untouchable. But for slaves and foreigners, there was no such protection. Their bodies belonged to their masters. Their consent didn't matter. Their pain was not heard. Even the Greek understanding of gender was unlike today's. Rigid categories. In myth, gods changed shapes, sexes, identities. Rituals allowed for gender-bending roles. What mattered wasn't the gender of the partner. It was the role they played. The dominant one was honored. The passive one was shamed. One god captures this idea best. Hermaphroditus, born of Hermes and Aphrodite. According to myth, he was fused with a nymph who loved him, becoming a single androgynous being, both man and woman. Even Zeus took male lovers or disguised himself as a woman in certain myths. But in everyday life, flexibility ended at the threshold of dominance. To be a passive male, to submit, that was dishonor. And so, male concubines, despite their numbers, were cloaked in stigma, needed but never respected. When Greece fell under Roman control, the practice lived on. Roman emperors, too, took male lovers. One, Elagabalus, went as far as to marry a male athlete named Zodicus in a public ceremony. Even in a decadent empire, his boldness caused a stir. Yet such unions survived until the world changed again. The rise of Christianity, a new order took hold. The old gods Zeus, Apollo, Aphrodite were cast aside. A single, all-powerful god replaced them, and with him came a rigid morality. In the 4th century A.D., the Codex Theodosianus outlawed same-sex unions altogether. Emperor Justinian I went further. Male-male intimacy became a capital crime. The age of the male concubine came to an end. Not with justice, but with condemnation. Was once celebrated was now heresy. The boys who once stood beside philosophers, artists, and rulers draped in silk became symbols of sin. Their stories were buried beneath altars and commandments. In some ways, this was the only justice they ever received, the end of their formal exploitation. But even this came with a cost. One form of oppression was replaced with another. Love wasn't. Set free, it was caged. Heterosexuality became law. And anything beyond it was cast into darkness. So now we return to that haunting question. Was being a male concubine in ancient Greece ever worth it? Or were these boys enslaved, adorned, and discarded, just another forgotten sacrifice to the altars of power and pride?